We've been uncovering amazing remains of a Byzantine church complex. The church covers an area of about 1.5 dunums.
What if I told you that buried beneath centuries of mud and silence, a single inscription, just a few lines of ancient Greek, has resurfaced, and it might shake the foundations of Christian theology? Not in Rome, not in theory, but in Galilee, where it all began. Archaeologists have just uncovered what some are calling the most important biblical discovery since the moon landing. A 1,500-year-old Byzantine church hidden near the Sea of Galilee, possibly built over the very hometown of Peter, Andrew, and Philip. Inside, a message frozen in time. A mosaic so pristine it could have been written yesterday, declaring Peter not just an apostle, but chief of the apostles, bearer of the keys to the kingdom of heaven. This isn't just history. This is theological dynamite, a divine message encoded in stone that may have just tipped the scales in one of the most contested debates in Christian history. What does it mean? And why is no one talking about it? Stay with me, because this changes everything. The discovery that shook the ground. Every once in a while, a discovery emerges not merely to inform us, but to confront us. This is one of those discoveries. For over a century, theologians, scholars, and pilgrims alike have debated the whereabouts of a town central to the gospel story. A place called Bethsaida, mentioned multiple times in the New Testament, and recognized as the hometown of 3 apostles, Peter, Andrew, and Philip. John 1:44 states it plainly. Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. But where exactly was Bethsaida? That question has lingered like a ghost over biblical scholarship. Theories were many, evidence was sparse, and the debates were often inconclusive. Until now. On the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, within reach of the waters that once carried the footsteps of Christ, a team of archaeologists led by Professor Mordecai Avium and Dr. Stephen Notley unearthed the ruins of a Byzantine-era church, hidden beneath layers of earth for over 1,400 years. And inside this church, what they found was not simply archaeological, it was theological. In the center of the ancient mosaic floor, etched in Koine Greek, gleamed an inscription that refers directly to Peter, not merely as an apostle or follower, but as the chief of the apostles and the bearer of the keys to the kingdom of heaven. The phrasing is unmistakable. It mirrors the language of Matthew 16:19, where Jesus declares to Peter, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." The discovery is extraordinary not only because of what it says, but because of how perfectly preserved it is. The mosaic, untouched for 14 centuries, looks almost newly crafted, its lines crisp, its letters sharp, its message unmarred by time. As if it had been sealed by providence, waiting for the right generation to uncover its meaning. Leading theologians and archaeologists alike have expressed a mix of amazement and gravity. Dr. Craig Evans, an expert in the historical Jesus, has noted that this could be the clearest archaeological link to Peter's home ever found. And Dr. Notley, co-director of the El Araj excavations, remarked, "It's not just about the mosaic, it's about what it confirms, the church, the town, the people. It's all aligning now." But to understand why this moment is so consequential, we must first explore why the story of Bethsaida is one of the greatest mysteries in biblical archaeology. Bethsaida, lost and found through time. Bethsaida, once a bustling fishing village, its name means House of the Fishermen in Aramaic, appropriate for the hometown of men whose lives would be changed forever by a Galilean teacher. According to the Gospels, Bethsaida was a place of miracles, where the blind were given sight, Mark 8:22, where thousands were fed with loaves and fishes, Luke 9:10 through 17, and where Jesus himself walked nearby on the surface of the water. And yet, Bethsaida is also one of the only cities Jesus explicitly cursed. Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago. After this ominous condemnation, the town disappears from the New Testament record, and soon after, from history itself. During the Middle Ages, pilgrims sought its location, guided only by fragmented legends and devotional tradition. But no consensus ever formed. The earth had swallowed the town, and with it, a portion of the Gospel's physical geography. In the 19th century, German and American researchers proposed Et Tel, a mound nearly 2 kilometers inland from the Galilee, as the possible site. Yet the choice raised problems. The distance from the water was significant. More importantly, the site lacked clear first-century Roman remains that would situate it in the time of Jesus. And for a village of fishermen, its location made little sense. The real shift came after the 1967 Six-Day War, when the region was reopened to exploration. Israeli surveys began to highlight a more promising candidate: El Araj, a low-lying area much closer to the Sea of Galilee. Fragments of pottery, glass, and mosaic began to suggest sustained occupation over centuries. But it wasn't until the early 2000s, after Pope John Paul II was flown over the region and greeted by the excavation team, that attention surged. He was presented with a replica of an ancient bronze key discovered at the site, a gesture rich in symbolism, alluding to the authority of Peter and the promise in Matthew 16. By 2016, a formal archaeological team, backed by institutions including the University of Nebraska at Omaha, launched a full-scale dig at El Araj. Within their first season, they found clear traces of Roman-era presence, including coins and tools dating to the 1st century CE. By 2018, their excavations had uncovered the foundations of a Byzantine basilica, as well as remnants of a bathhouse, guest rooms, and a public complex. And then came the inscriptions. The Greek text, encircled in a delicate geometric mosaic frame, contains a prayer for a man named Constantine, not the emperor, but likely a local patron. It names Peter in unmistakable terms, Chief of the Apostles, holder of the keys of the heavenly spheres. This aligns precisely with the 8th century travel writings of Willibald, a Bavarian bishop who visited Bethsaida and recorded spending the night in a church dedicated to Peter and Andrew. For decades, scholars dismissed Willibald's account as devotional myth. But now, the very church he described may have been found. The stones are real, the titles are intact, and the language, bold, theological, and confident, declares what early Christians truly believed. The church beneath the soil. Beneath layers of Galilean soil, under centuries of silence and seasonal floods, lay a sacred structure hidden from the eyes of history. It waited quietly, while kingdoms rose and fell, while empires came and went, while maps were redrawn and faith traditions divided. Then, in 2016, spades met stone. The excavation at El Araj began with questions, but it quickly yielded answers. Within weeks, archaeologists unearthed the foundations of a Byzantine church, resting upon even older Roman layers. A vertical timeline of worship, devotion, and continuity. What emerged was not simply a place of prayer. It was a complex containing a church, a bathhouse, and what appeared to be an ancient hostel or monastic guest house, precisely the kind of infrastructure one would expect at a site visited by early Christian pilgrims. And this is where the written word returned. 3 separate Greek inscriptions were found embedded in the mosaic floor of the church. 2 were fragmented, but one, preserved in near-perfect condition, bears the full weight of 1,000 years of theology in just a few lines. Within an elegant circular frame of tessellated stone, the inscription reads, "The whole work of paving the diakon with mosaic was done by the zeal of Constantine, servant of Christ, for the chief of the apostles and holder of the keys of the heavenly spheres. Saint Peter, intercede for him and his children." This isn't poetic metaphor. This is precise, liturgical, and theological language. It doesn't call Peter simply a disciple. It names him chief of the apostles, a title implying not equality, but authority. And it refers to him as holder of the keys, a phrase echoing Christ's words in Matthew 16:19 and rooted in the messianic imagery of Isaiah 22:22, where keys represent dynastic succession and exclusive stewardship. The use of such exalted language is not coincidental. It reflects what the early Byzantine Christians believed, not just about Peter, but about this very location. Even more astonishing is how perfectly this discovery aligns with the testimony of Willibald, the Bavarian bishop, who, in 725 AD, recorded staying overnight in a church in Bethsaida, dedicated to Peter and Andrew. His writings describe a site by the water, with facilities for guests, and an atmosphere of sacred commemoration. For centuries, Willibald's account was treated with suspicion, dismissed by modern scholars as pious exaggeration or a romanticized retelling of pilgrim life. But now, with the church, the layout, and the very dedication stone all matching his description, the text of a medieval traveler becomes something more: eyewitness evidence. The church beneath the soil did more than preserve names and prayers. It preserved memory. It preserved belief. And in doing so, it hands us something extraordinarily rare in biblical archaeology: a bridge between textual testimony and physical reality. And that bridge leads us into a far more pressing question: not just what this place is, but why it matters. Because once we confirm the site, we must ask what it confirms, why this matters. It's one thing to uncover the ruins of an ancient church, but it's something else entirely to find that church constructed directly over a first-century village, a village that aligns with the Gospels in both location and story, a village that may very well be the hometown of Peter, Andrew, and Philip. This isn't poetic coincidence or pious myth. This is historical continuity, rising from beneath the soil, a sacred memory preserved not just in scripture, but in stone, in architecture, and in the communal traditions of the early church. The church at El Araj, likely built in the 5th or 6th century, was not placed arbitrarily. Early Christians didn't scatter churches randomly across the landscape. They built intentionally, over places they revered, over places they remembered, over places they believed God had moved. We see this pattern throughout the Holy Land. The Church of the Nativity stands in Bethlehem, over the cave believed to mark Christ's birth. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre rises in Jerusalem, over the traditional site of his crucifixion and resurrection. The Church of the Annunciation in Nazareth commemorates the angel's message to Mary. And now, perhaps, Bethsaida, long debated and forgotten, has re-emerged with similar markers of sacred memory. The people who built that church did not have access to modern archaeology, GPS, or carbon dating. What they had was living memory, oral tradition, and a sense of spiritual geography, a closeness not only in time, but in trust. They knew where to build because the memory of what had happened there had not yet faded. The remains at El Araj confirm that first-century life flourished there. Coins, ceramics, tools, and structures all point to an active, thriving fishing village. This was not just a possible location, it was a place with real people, real stories, and, perhaps, real apostles. And rising above it all, a church. A church not just dedicated to any figure, but to Peter, the man to whom Jesus said, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." That alone would be extraordinary. But the inscription found within the church goes further. It doesn't simply honor Peter as a saint or an apostle. It calls him Chief of the Apostles, a title not of casual respect, but of theological conviction. The word used, koryphaios, is not ambiguous. It implies leadership, headship, a place of preeminence among the 12. It identifies Peter as the one who stood above the rest, not just by chance, but by divine appointment. And consider this: the inscription wasn't crafted in Latin. It didn't come from Rome. It wasn't part of a later papal claim. It was written in Greek, laid into the mosaic floor by Byzantine Christians, long before the Great Schism, in a region closer to the apostles in both time and place. This is incredibly important, because it tells us that the idea of Peter's primacy, his unique authority among the apostles, was not a Roman invention. It was already embedded in the thought and worship of the early undivided church, both in East and West. And then, perhaps most striking of all, is the second title, Holder of the Keys to the Heavenly Kingdom. This isn't poetic metaphor or liturgical decoration. It is a direct reference to Matthew 16:19, a verse that has served as a cornerstone of Catholic theology for centuries. It's the very moment where Jesus gives Peter authority, spiritual, binding, enduring. This verse has been cited in councils, debated in the Reformation, and defended in catechisms. And now it has been found inscribed in stone in Peter's homeland by people who lived centuries before many of those theological battles even began. This doesn't prove everything, but it proves something very important. It proves that Peter's unique role was recognized, honored, and proclaimed across Christian traditions, long before the theological lines were drawn. It shows us that, in the land where Peter fished and followed, the early church remembered him not as just another apostle, but as the one chosen to lead the keys, the kingdom, and the debate. For nearly 2,000 years, the role of Peter has stood at the center of Christian identity and division. Critics of the Catholic position often point to Matthew 18:18, where Jesus appears to extend the authority to bind and loose to all the apostles, suggesting that Peter was not uniquely privileged, but rather a representative of the collective. And it's true, the other apostles were indeed given authority. But what they were not given were the keys. That detail matters more than it first appears. In ancient times, keys were symbols of stewardship and exclusive access, not just to physical places, but to delegated royal power. To hold the king's keys was to wield his authority in his absence. This symbolism is rooted in Isaiah 22:22, where God says of Eliakim, "I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open." The passage has long been understood as a foreshadowing of Christ's authority and of the one to whom he would entrust that authority. That parallel is unmistakable in Matthew 16, and the connection is strengthened by what we've now found at El Araj. Because this archaeological discovery shows that the interpretation linking Peter to singular authority and succession was not a later theological innovation, nor confined to Roman Catholicism. It was widely embraced by the early Byzantine Church, centuries before the rise of medieval papal structures, and long before the East-West split. In this one inscription, we see the convergence of scripture, tradition, and memory, a confirmation that, even in the Galilee, Peter's role as keeper of the heavenly keys was revered and acknowledged. No, this find does not prove the modern papacy, nor does it demand Catholic belief. But what it does is anchor the Catholic interpretation in deep historical soil. It reminds us that the idea of Peter as the visible head of the Church is not the product of a political consolidation in Rome, but rather a belief so strong, so early, and so widespread that even in the very region where Peter lived, it was written in stone. For non-Catholics, this is not necessarily a challenge to faith, but it is a challenge to consider. Could the continuity of this belief, spanning centuries, empires, languages, and liturgies, be dismissed so easily? Or does it invite a deeper reflection, not just on Peter himself, but on the nature of leadership, authority, and unity within the Church? This discovery doesn't force a conclusion, but it does present a question that cannot be ignored. What began as a routine excavation on the shores of Galilee has become a moment of profound significance, a discovery where faith, history, and scripture meet in stone. The mosaic unearthed at El Araj is more than just an artifact. It is a message from the past, clear, confident, and preserved against all odds. Its words affirm not only Peter's name, but his role, his authority, and the memory that early Christians held with conviction. This is not just about geography. It's not just about archaeology. It's about the continuity of belief, spanning empires, centuries, and continents, and now confirmed by the very earth where it began. In a time when many question the reliability of sacred tradition, this simple inscription stands as a quiet thunderclap, a reminder that the early Church remembered more than we thought, and preserved more than we imagined. As one reader said, "It's the most important thing I've read since the moon landing." Because in that moment, the past wasn't just remembered, it was revealed. And now, we are left with a question not of whether it happened, but of what we'll do with what we now know. History and faith have collided, and the dust is still settling.